So last time we were discussing how the Japanese Americans, let's recall that 2/3 of those who would be sent to the prisoner camps were Nisei, that is, born in the United States. 1/3 would be Issei, and of course, they're born in Japan. And let's recall that the prisoner camps, the internment camps, were built away from the West Coast, away from places considered vital military installations, and vital factory zones. So they're in the Midwest. Let's recall the Great Desert that I mentioned last time. Quite a few of them were located in these desolate places away from populations, very sparsely populated. And I described life in the camps with the previous video. And here's some visuals. And of course, you could look on YouTube to get some more visuals of it. But as you can see, the conditions seem quite desolate. Definitely away from the large cities, right? Seems like no human habitation in the surrounding areas. So they are isolated, and that's, of course, the intention of the government and the WRA, the War Relocation Authority. Their intention was indeed to isolate them. And here's some more depictions here. You see the cots instead of their comfortable beds, no privacy. And in this slide, you see the barbed wire fence. So they are surrounded by barbed wire. And to the back are the mountain ranges. So you know there's really no way that they could escape. I did mention this in the previous video. Very isolated cases, only a handful of cases where people actually tried to escape, but they were shot and killed by the sentries there. So this was life behind barbed wire for the Japanese Americans interned. So with the completion of the actual concentration camps, more inland, as I mentioned, finally you see the Japanese move from the detention centers or the assembly centers towards that of the actual camps. And by 1942, interestingly enough, there was an idea that was tossed around with the U.S. military about the possibility of a military draft of young Nisei men. Now, let me remind you, Nisei refers to second-generation Americans, Japanese Americans, that is, born in the United States. So there was this notion that perhaps a regiment of Japanese Americans could be formed, and they would be sent to the European theater to fight against the Nazi and Italian enemy overseas in Europe, rather than the Pacific against the Japanese. Okay, so this was actually put into motion. And if you were a Japanese American, perhaps you saw this as an opportunity to prove your loyalty to the United States, right? You're, of course, dismayed, to put it mildly, if not very upset, that you were considered unloyal and therefore placed in the concentration camps. So once this idea of forming a Japanese American regiment gets circulated, in fact, many young Nisei men were all too willing to join. And that way they could demonstrate their loyalty to their country, to the United States of America. All right. Now, there was, however, some resistance among the young Nisei men. By the way, in 1943, the War Relocation Authority, which, if you recall, was in charge of setting up the camps, well, they subjected the Japanese American men to a loyalty test to discern whether or not it would be a good idea to form this all-Japanese American regiment to fight in the European theater. So here is an excerpt from that questionnaire that circulated among the young Japanese men. And notice questions 27 and 28. 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" 28, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces?" and forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization. So obviously, this questionnaire is trying to determine the degree of loyalty that Japanese Americans held. And if it was determined to be a high degree of loyalty, well, they could proceed to form that all-Japanese regiment. Now, interestingly enough, even though the overwhelming number of young Japanese men, the respondents, answered yes to both, there were some who answered no to both. But it's important to take note here. Why did they respond no to question 27 and 28? Well, according to them, from their perspective at least, they mentioned that they had no reservations about fighting for the United States. They understood that the war was against fascism, to fight against, those who were the enemies of freedom. So for those who answered no to question 27, 28, it was due to the fact that there's this hypocrisy involved here. They're asking the Japanese Americans to serve, to risk their lives on the battlefield for freedom and democracy, yet they face the conditions of unfreedom and lack of democracy in the camps. And of course, so too to their families, and for that matter, all Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So the hypocrisy was glaring to them, and they answered no on principle because they were unwilling to serve in the armed forces of the United States, or with question 28, they're unwilling to swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America. Why? Because of these acts that were perpetrated against them and their families and Japanese Americans across the board, in not trusting them and considering them a fifth column. And they could not overcome, or, they could not get past that hypocrisy. So they felt on principle, that is, that they should answer no to 27 and 28. And again, let me remind you, they're answering no, not because they were unwilling to risk their lives for their country. It's because they couldn't, again, get around the fact that there was a lot of hypocrisy involved in this idea of, asking the loyalty of Nisei, right? Okay, so interestingly enough, with the loyalty tests that were circulated around the camps, those who answered no became known as the no Japanese. Why? Because they answered no to question 27 and 28. Okay, so that's the no Japanese. Some of them were called the no boys because, of course, they're all men who are going to be enlisted in the U.S. Army to fight. And in fact, by the way, there's a novel by a Japanese-American author called No Boy, which is about this person who answers no to 27, 28 and his life in post-war America. Okay, so that's the no boys, but again, I have to remind you, the overwhelming majority of the Nisei young men indeed answered yes to both 27, 28. Why? They had this burning desire to prove their loyalty, and they knew that it would be on the battlefield where they could demonstrate their loyalty. Okay, now you also see other forms of protest besides the no boys. Obviously, that's a form of protest. But you see more legal avenues that were pursued by some Japanese Americans with the passage of Executive Order 9066. These were the cases of Hirabayashi and Yasui, but perhaps the most well-known is Korematsu. So first, with the cases of Hirabayashi and Yasui, these were early cases challenging the forced curfew that was imposed upon the Japanese Americans a few weeks after the attack in Pearl Harbor. And they deliberately broke curfew laws, curfew rules, and they sought arrest. So that way they could pursue that legal avenue to challenge the constitutionality of Japanese detention and the curfew and all that stuff. But both cases were rejected by the Supreme Court. Okay, they lost their cases. Now, the most well-known is the Korematsu case. And by the way, Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui are all Nisei. That is, they're born in the United States. They're U.S. citizens and very Americanized, okay, very assimilated. Now, Fred Korematsu, he, of course, was a young Nisei man, and he was told, as all the Japanese Americans were, to report and register at the assembly centers. And instead of doing that, he went underground. He did not report. And he was basically started working in a factory to survive, to get by economically, a war production factory. So in a way, ironically, he's contributing to the war effort, but he's also underground and trying to evade, arrest. But he does get finally caught by the FBI. And during this time that he's being held, he got approached from some civil rights attorneys who wanted to see if they could handle his case and the challenge that he wanted to pursue regarding, again, the constitutionality of internment. Okay, so, of course, Fred Korematsu agrees because, obviously, he feels strongly against the internment of the Japanese, strongly against Executive Order 9066. He knows it's very un-American. He considers himself an American, and he just happens to have, Japanese parents. So, like I said, he assembles a legal team of attorneys, and this case travels all the way up to the Supreme Court. And by 1944, the Supreme Court, in December 1944, I should say, the Supreme Court finally considers the case, and in their decision, they upheld his conviction by a 6-3 vote. So the writer of the opinion, by the way, the justice who was charged with writing the opinion, the overall opinion of the Korematsu case, interestingly enough, and perhaps egregiously, he used to be a Klan member in his earlier life. By the way, later on, this justice, his name was Hugo Black, by the way. And it's hard to believe, especially nowadays, right, that you have a Supreme Court justice who had a sordid past, to put it mildly, as a Klan member. But later on, he would explain it away as, hey, this is the way it was in the South. I was trying to achieve, mobility in my profession as a lawyer, and I had no choice but to join the Klan. That was his justification. In any case, Justice Hugo Black, the ex-Klan member, asserted that Korematsu, and therefore other Japanese, were not excluded from the military areas of the West Coast. They're not interned away from the West Coast and towards inland, as I described, due to race. The reason was not race. The reason was due to military necessity. And you have to recall that phrase. I first brought it up in the discussion of General John DeWitt, right, in his justification as to why the Japanese should be interned. So you have Hugo Black, basically, Supreme Court Justice, basically reiterating what DeWitt is saying. But interestingly enough, also, he later went public justifying internment, and this is what he said, quote, "They all look alike to a person not a Jap," unquote. All right, so he's on record for saying that. There were some dissenting judges, obviously, and of course that's a 6-3 vote. So the three justices who were against it recognized that internment was based solely upon racial background, racial ancestry, and thus opposed it on the grounds of its constitutionality.